Monday, August 9th, 1965. A man sits before a television camera, dressed in white. This is Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore. As he speaks to his people, he breaks down. He cannot stop the tears. He isn't crying from happiness. He is crying because of a catastrophe. Singapore had just been expelled from Malaysia. It was the only country in modern history to gain independence against its own will. To understand why this was a nightmare, look at the map. Singapore is a tiny island with zero natural resources. In 1965, it didn't even have enough fresh water. It had to buy it from the very neighbor that just kicked it out. It had no defense force. It had no hinterland. The British military was leaving, threatening to wipe out 20% of the economy. The streets were filled with racial tension and slums. By every rule of economics, Singapore was dead on arrival. It should have collapsed, but the leadership team made a decision born of desperation. They had no margin for error. Since their neighbors wouldn't trade with them, they decided to leapfrog the region and trade with the world. In the 1960s, the economic trend for developing nations was import substitution. This meant blocking foreign goods and trying to make everything yourself. It was a patriotic idea, but for Singapore, it was suicide. A domestic market of 2 million poor people couldn't sustain an economy, so Singapore did the unthinkable. They did the exact opposite of what the experts advised. They threw their doors open to the West. They created the Economic Development Board, or EDB. Their job was to act like corporate salesmen. They flew to America and Europe to pitch Singapore as a manufacturing base. They offered tax breaks, cheap labor, and something rare in Southeast Asia: absolute stability. There is a famous story about Texas Instruments. When the American tech giant showed interest, the Singaporean government promised them they could start production within 50 days. It sounded impossible, but the government cleared every hurdle, built the infrastructure, and ran the power lines. Texas Instruments was up and running in 50 days. When Hewlett-Packard and General Electric saw this, they followed. While other post-colonial nations viewed foreign corporations with suspicion, Singapore viewed them as mentors. They used these factories to teach their people how to work, how to manage, and how to engineer. This turned a population of unskilled laborers into a disciplined industrial workforce. But factories alone don't build a nation. You cannot have a stable economy if your people sleep in fire-prone slums. In the 60s, the housing situation was dire. The government knew that if people had nothing to lose, they would riot. They needed the people to have a literal stake in the country. Enter the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. They began building high-rise apartments at a frantic pace. But the real genius was the financing. The government used the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. This was a mandatory savings scheme where workers and employers contributed a percentage of salaries. Originally for retirement, the government changed the rules to allow people to use these savings to buy their homes. Suddenly, a factory worker could own an apartment. This changed the psychology of the entire country. It turned a transient population into stakeholders. If you own a home, you don't burn down the neighborhood. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in these government-built flats, and nearly all of them own the lease. It created a bedrock of social stability that allowed the economy to thrive. With jobs and homes secured, the government turned to the software of the nation, the mindset. Kuan Yew believed that to survive, Singapore had to be exceptional. It had to be a first-world oasis in a third-world region. They enforced strict laws that the West mocked. They banned chewing gum to keep the trains clean. They fined people for littering and not flushing toilets. They planted millions of trees to hide the concrete, but the most critical element was the rule of law. In a region famous for corruption, Singapore became a fortress of integrity. The government paid its ministers high salaries to remove the temptation of bribes, and they punished corruption mercilessly. This created an intangible asset worth billions: trust. International banks and corporations knew that in Singapore, contracts would be honored. Your assets wouldn't be seized. This trust became Singapore's competitive advantage, attracting wealth from all over the globe. By the 1980s, cheap labor wasn't enough. Neighbors like China and Vietnam were opening up, and they were cheaper. Singapore had to evolve. They had to move from the hands of the economy to the brain. They targeted high-value industries, finance, biotech, and petrochemicals. They decided to become the financial hub of Asia, the Switzerland of the East. They liberalized the banking sector and built infrastructure like Changi Airport, what's it designed to be the best in the world. Critically, they doubled down on their only real resource, people. The government made a painful but strategic decision to keep English as the main language of instruction in schools. This ensured that every Singaporean graduate could plug instantly into the global economy. They weren't just learning for Singapore, they were learning for the world market. Today, the transformation is complete. The swamp is gone. In its place is the Marina Bay Sands, a symbol of extreme wealth. Singapore has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, surpassing its former colonizer, the United Kingdom. It has solved its water crisis through technology, recycling sewage into ultra-clean water. It is a hub for global family offices and a sanctuary for capital flight. However, this success came at a cost. It is one of the most expensive of cities on Earth. The pressure on students is immense. The pace of life is relentless. It is a society engineered for efficiency, sometimes at the expense of soul. The story of how Singapore got crazy rich isn't a fairy tale. It's a case study in pragmatism. It proves that geography isn't destiny. Singapore succeeded because it was paranoid. The leaders woke up every day afraid that it would all disappear. That fear drove them to plan decades ahead. They ran the country like a corporation, where the citizens are the shareholders and the dividend is prosperity. From a tearful leader in a TV studio to a glittering global financial center, Singapore's journey teaches one lesson. When you have no resources, your only option is to be smarter, faster, and more disciplined than everyone else. Survival, it turns out, is the best motivation for getting rich.